Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my Rosaria guide. In this video, we're going to be covering everything you need to know about Rosaria. And right off the bat, I want to say you can run her as a support or a DPS. You can play her how you like. And she is viable in both, but I think she is much better as a support. She's a very strong burst support who can shine in specific comps. In this video, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know. Weapons, artifacts, team comps, literally everything. I'm going to start right off by comparing her with Kaeya and talking about their differences, just because I know I'm going to get that question a lot. Overall though, I really like this character, so I'm excited to talk to you guys about her. Before I begin, I want you guys to know that I stream almost every night on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested. Subscribe if you're new, and let's get right into it. First of all, I want to clear up the commonly asked question comparing her to Kaeya. Overall, they have different uses and can be used together, but I would summarize it thusly. Basically, Kaeya has faster cryo application, and if you just want a support who applies cryo, you can use Kaeya for that. However, Rosaria shines exceptionally well for being a melt support, and her damage as a melt support, especially at C2, is much higher. And at C0 for melt burst damage, she can be better as well, but she does need like more energy recharge and stuff. And personally, I really like running them together in a really nice Quickswap melt team, which I'll show you guys at the end of the video, where they can both shine exceptionally well. Additionally, Rosaria does offer you crit rate in her talents, so she'll give your whole team 15% crit rate, and we'll talk about this in a little, but she gives you a bunch of crit rate, but her cryo application is slower than Kaeya. However, for her damage from her burst in like a melt team, it can be higher, once again, especially with her second constellation, which we'll go over in a bit. I do want to say that overall, I'm very happy with Rosaria though. I really like her, and I think there's a lot of comps that make her shine exceptionally well. I don't think she's broken by any means, but I think she's a well-balanced unit and very fun to play. With that out of the way, let's talk about her talents and her abilities. So first of all, her E, her elemental skill, will teleport you behind the opponent unless it's like a really large enemy like a Ruin Guard. It won't teleport you behind them, but it usually does teleport you behind an opponent and strike them twice for a pretty decent amount of damage. The scaling, as you can see at level 6, is pretty good. On top of that, with one of your passive talents, this actually increases Rosaria's crit rate by 12% right after your elemental skill, which is really good because you can just use this before your burst. You can press your E and then your Q, and then your burst will have that crit rate bonus. On top of that, your other passive is actually really, really good. This is the biggest reason I use Rosaria in a lot of my comps. It does give crit rate to your whole team. She actually gives 15% of her crit rate. So let's say you have a 100% crit rate, which yes, can be hard to get. But so obviously that means if you do have a 100% crit rate, which is hard to get, but if you do have a 100% crit rate, you can give your team 15% crit, which is very good. Even if it is a bit less than 15%, that's still very nice. And her other talent works well with this because you can effectively get away with less crit rate because you gain 12% here, and then that is also transferred over. I haven't even talked about her burst yet. I usually talk about the skills before the talents, but both of these talents are very good, especially this one, so I did want to cover them because it is one of the big reasons I like Rosaria. Rite of Termination is her elemental burst. This basically just does massive damage every 2 seconds, and it has no internal cooldown. What that means is every 2 seconds, every time it procs, it'll do damage and it'll apply cryo, and it'll melt every single hit if the enemies are pyro, which makes melt comps where Rosaria shines actually pretty strong. And a lot of cryo abilities, cryo ultimates, have a long internal cooldown if you look at like other cryo characters, but Rosaria's does not, and it's very strong. It initially hits twice with a very high scaling, and then every 2 seconds it'll proc another time, dealing a big sum of damage. On top of that, the cooldown is 15 seconds, the energy cost is 60, which really isn't too high. And if you have her Constellation 2, it lasts an extra 4 seconds, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but that is very, very strong. And in my opinion, you don't need Constellations for her, but her C2 is actually very big and gives her a lot more damage, right? But overall, she has 2 cryo abilities that do a pretty good amount of damage and can melt consistently. And then both of her talents are very nice, especially this one, buffing your crit rate by a lot. Also, something I forgot to mention, and this is recorded later, so if my voice sounds different, I'm sorry, but her burst actually snapshots. If you don't know what snapshotting is, basically her stats will be factored in at the start of her burst for her whole burst, which means if you use Bennett's ult, his burst, or you just apply any buffs to your Rosaria, let's say Thrilling Tales, or again, Bennett's a good example, as soon as you press your burst, your stats will be factored in for the whole duration of it, which means even if you lose the buff halfway through, the damage that you're doing per proc won't go down. So it is something to keep in mind, and it can be very good. Now let's talk about Rosaria's artifacts. We're going to start with artifact sets and then move on to stats so we can cover everything. Regarding her sets, there are a few good ones. However, her best one overall, in my opinion, is running a 2-piece Noblesse Oblige for 20% elemental burst damage because your burst does do quite a bit, and 2-piece Blizzard Strayer for another 15% damage on all your cryo. So effectively, you're going to get that 15% buff to your E and your Q, your skill and your burst, and then your Noblesse is going to buff your burst an additional 20%.
Now, if you're running her in a melt comp where she's going to be melting, Lava Walker can be good, the 4-piece, because it gives you 35% damage against pyro affected opponents. However, it is inconsistent, and I feel like her burst doesn't melt like every hit. There is no ICD, but it can be inconsistent and annoying. So overall, I recommend 2 Noblesse with 2 Cryo, but Lava Walker can be a good option as well.
If you're running her as a pure DPS, you can run her with like a Chongyun and a 4-piece Blizzard Strayer or a Crescent Pike physical DPS. But I do want to clarify this now that I did title this video Best Rosaria Build, and the best way to play Rosaria is running her as a burst support or a sub DPS with a bunch of cryo damage, you know, in a Quickswap team, where she is doing a ton of damage. She is basically DPSing without being like a main DPS, right? She's a sub DPS, but she's still doing a ton of damage in like a Quickswap team. So that's why in this video, I'm not talking too much about just like auto attacking on your Rosaria, like those type of builds. I might, as I said a few times in this video, I might make a separate video on that type of Rosaria, but in terms of the best Rosaria build, it is usually running her as a burst support, a Quickswap DPS, sub DPS, whatever you want to call it. And if you do want to run her main DPS, I recommend Cryo over physical because the Blizzard Strayer set is pretty insane, like 40% crit rate if frozen, if you're also running like Qingqiu and Chongyun, is a lot of crit rate, and you get 15% cryo damage on everything.
Now for the artifact stats, there's actually quite a few good stats on her. Crit is exceptional if you want her to deal damage. Attack percent and elemental mastery can also increase her damage, especially if she's melting. And energy recharge is good on her. Now I'm going to get the question a lot as to how much energy recharge you need if you need it on the sands, right? If you're going to run an ER sands or an attack sands or elemental mastery or whatever. So I'm going to try to clear up all of that. Basically regarding her energy recharge, it highly depends on the comp you're running. If you're running Rosaria with another cryo character who will generate cryo particles, or in like a Quickswap team where you're spamming your elemental skill, you definitely need a lot less ER than in a comp where she's just a support, like your only cryo support. Who needs particles, right? You're not giving particles to her. It'll be hard, so she'll need more energy recharge. So to get more into like the details, I personally run a melt Quickswap comp, which we're going to go over in the party comp section at the end. But I run Rosaria with Kaeya in a melt Quickswap team, right? So I'm using a bunch of abilities, and I always have my burst up on cooldown with only 133 energy recharge. And so that's only a few good substats. It's not actually that much energy recharge, but that is a comp that's generating a lot of particles for her. If you are running her as a lonesome cryo support who isn't really getting that much love like particle wise, I could recommend running an energy recharge sands and maybe stacking it up as much as you need. Once again, depending on your comp. So for the sands, unless you need energy recharge, I would recommend attack percent for more damage. Elemental mastery can work too for melting, but overall it seems attack percent is the best. And for your goblet, you definitely want cryo damage bonus. And for your circlet, crit damage or crit rate are both good. Crit rate is usually better on Rosaria because she does want a lot of crit for her talent, which we saw earlier. So for most people, I'd recommend crit rate. But if you're running her as like a burst support or like melting, or if she's doing a lot of damage, you do also want crit damage on her. So you can sometimes run a crit damage circlet like I do because my substats have enough crit rate already, and I have the deathmatch weapon. Keep in mind this video is a support Rosaria, burst support, sub DPS, whatever you want to call it, sort of build / guide. But basically you can run her physical or cryo as DPS. I personally like running her cryo with 4 Blizzard Strayer. But again, I'm going to keep this video support focused. And if you want more DPS Rosaria info, it'll be in a separate video. Weapon-wise for Rosaria, there's actually a lot of good options, and I'll give you guys the best ones for sort of every type of player and go over, you know, 4 stars, 5 stars, all that. But I do want to say that a lot of spears are actually good on her / viable on her and depend on your comp and all that stuff. So with that out of the way, let's go over them. First of all, for your free-to-play options, there's the blacksmith ones, and there's 3 stars. First of all, I want to say the best 3-star, and in my opinion, the only viable one is White Tassel. And while for a support, you're not going to be using the effect and the low base attack will hurt you, it does give you crit rate as a substat, which can be good purely for her passive, giving crit rate to the team. However, I'm not a big fan of White Tassel because I like the low base attack, and it just kind of hurts me to have a 3-star weapon on a burst support who wants to deal damage, but the crit rate stat is nice for her, so it's something I want to mention. The prototype Star Glitter, however, is a free-to-play weapon, a blacksmith weapon with a okay base attack and energy recharge on the stat. So if your Rosaria does want energy recharge, this can be a good polearm for you and a great free-to-play option.
And unless you really don't need ER, I would recommend Star Glitter as the best free-to-play option over White Tassel. And I do want to mention that Crescent Pike is good for like DPS, especially physical, but not so much for a support Rosaria.
For her 4 stars, she has a lot of good options. My favorite is the Deathmatch. It has a low base attack, but the crit rate substat is really high and the effect is good. Given the low base attack, it's actually especially good with Bennett because Bennett gives so much attack to you and your burst does snapshot, as I mentioned, that it definitely makes up for the low base attack because you can Bennett burst, give your Rosaria that attack from the burst and the noblesse, and it does make up for the base attack, and I really like Deathmatch. I think it's one of the best weapons overall for her. Other good 4 stars include the Dragon's Bane if you're melting, because opponents will be affected by Pyro, so you'll get the bonus damage, and it gives you Elemental Mastery once again for your melt. but it does have a low base attack. Lithic Spear is also okay because high base attack percent, and especially with the refinement, gives a lot of crit per Liyue character, but keep in mind that Rosaria isn't from Liyue, and a lot of characters that are good with her, like Bennett, like Kaeya, aren't from Liyue either. The energy recharge polearms, notably Favonius Lance, can be good. Favonius Lance gives you a high base attack and a lot of energy gen through the passive and the effect. And once again, this weapon can be good or not good depending on your comp. I don't want to make a video where I'm just saying it depends, but in my personal Quickswap team, which I'll show you guys at the end, I don't need this much ER, so it would be a lot worse than something like a Deathmatch, which I think is the best 4-star for her. But if you're running her as a solo cryo support in like a Shao team, you can run a Favonius Lance on her. Blackcliff Pole is also a viable option, but worse than Deathmatch. In terms of the 5-stars, they're actually all good. Holma gives you a ton of damage, right? Crit damage and base attack. Jade Spear as well, and it gives you that crit rate. And Skyward Spine can be great for the base attack and the energy recharge stat if you do need that. But overall, I like crit rate weapons a lot because of her talent, so if you do have something like a Deathmatch, it is great on her.
Constellation wise, I am C0 because I can only pull Barbara for some reason, but Rosaria actually has really good constellations, so I want to talk about them.
I mentioned in like the talent section that C2 is very good. And this is actually the first one I want to talk about. Her second constellation is her biggest one by far for a burst support Rosaria. This will give you 2 more procs of your E. It'll last longer, apply more cryo, it'll melt, as I said, 2 more times, a lot of damage that you can get from this one constellation. On top of just the damage, you will get more cryo application too. Her cryo application isn't the fastest, and if you want a support just for cryo application, I recommend Kaeya over Rosaria. But for like a reverse melt comp, when you want your Rosaria to do damage and apply cryo and melt or whatever, having this constellation is really, really good. And I am probably going to pull for it in one of my future streams. Other than that, let's go in order. So her Constellation 1 is very good for a main DPS Rosaria because it increases her attack speed, which is very good for her, and her normal attack damage when you crit. So good for a DPS Rosaria, but not really good for support. Her C3 and 5 just give her levels, which are good, more damage, especially on your burst is nice. Her C4 gives her energy, which overall is very good for Rosaria. You get 5 energy per crit on your skill, which is pretty big. And your C6 decreases physical resistance of opponents, so that's either good for, once again, physical DPS Rosaria, or in a comp where your main DPS is a physical carry. So in like a Razor comp, if you're super conducting, this can just be a nice bonus resistance shred. Her constellations overall are actually pretty good. I do like them, but you don't need them. You can run her at C0. However, if you do want to pull for constellations, I would recommend C2 because it is very good.
Now let's talk about Rosaria's teams, and this is a very important and honestly misunderstood section. She just came out, so there's still a lot of theory crafting to do for team comps, but me and my math guys at F77, link in the description, have been testing a bunch, and we have found some very good ones, and I want to talk to you guys about different comps you can use for her. You can run her in a comp that makes her shine, a melt Quickswap team, which we're going to talk about, but you can also just fit her into a normal comp as a support if you want to give your team crit rate, have burst damage and stuff. And her scalings in comps that don't let her reverse melt like this one, which again we'll talk about, isn't as good as a lot of other burst supports, but she does make up for it by giving you crit rate, so you can use her that way. I had a lot of fun running her in my Shao team, where my Shao also has an Anemo battery, and then I run Rosaria with a healer who, in my case, is Diona, to give more particles to Rosaria, letting me run less energy recharge. My personal favorite way to run Rosaria, and one of the best comps for her, is a Quickswap team. Basically here, Rosaria and Kaeya are like 2 of the same unit, where both of their bursts do insane amount of damage and can reverse melt, meaning like melting with the weaker element, and they both do a ton of damage. My Rosaria, and you guys will see this in the showcase, can do like 25 to 30k melt damage every single proc of her burst. With proper setup, I even managed to do like 50k on the plant, and on top of that, Xiangling's gonna be doing massive damage, and every character in this comp not only works well together, but they're also all 4 stars, so it is a pretty accessible comp. My Rosaria personally is C0, but she shines exceptionally well in teams like these at C2 if you can get that. So yeah, my favorite team and one example team is this reverse melt Quickswap, where you're just spamming your bursts and your skills on everyone, and even with low enough energy, like pretty low energy recharge, I was managing to get all my bursts back on time. My Rosaria only had 130 energy recharge, and it was more than enough. This other team is a freeze comp, which is a Quickswap freeze team. Now, if you replace Kaeya with Chongyun, and I saw this comp floating around a lot, it can work, but Rosaria becomes your main DPS. And once again, if you want to build Rosaria as a DPS, you can. But when you run Kaeya here, this becomes a Quickswap freeze comp. And I'll put footage on screen now, and I'll put it in the showcase too, I think. But basically, this comp lets you spam a bunch of bursts and abilities, doing a ton of damage and perma-freezing enemies. It is very cozy. It's not as much damage as the melt comp, obviously, because you're not melting, you don't have a pyronado, but it is still pretty good, and it freezes enemies, which can be nice. Also, something to note, I just put Jean here for the Viridescent Vener healer. Also, I want to add that there are a lot of good variations with this freeze comp. I like having a healer, but you actually don't need one because you're perma-freezing enemies. Running something like Child can be very comfy and a fun comp, especially if you want to run Child and Rosaria together. You can also replace this last character with Mona, and I've seen some builds on like Prototype Amber, which seemed pretty good, and she does buff your damage with her burst, so there are a few variations of this comp that I do want to mention, and these sort of freeze Rosaria comps, especially when they're Quickswap oriented, can be very good and very fun to play. Regarding her as just a pure burst support in a comp revolving around another DPS, I personally like her because she gives you a lot of crit rate. I run her with Diona as an example in this team because Diona generates cryo particles for her, basically diminishing the amount of energy recharge I need. But if you do want to run her as a pure support, you can fit her in most comps as long as you stack energy recharge and crit rate on her to make use of her talent and her burst. I also want to mention she can be a good superconduct support because her burst, especially with her second constellation, does last quite a while, and she does give you crit rate, which is a bonus. If you are C6, she obviously gets better for a physical carry like Razor, but since she is a cryo support, generally speaking, you can run her for superconduct. And very quickly, for a main DPS, if you're running her as a physical DPS, you'd want like superconduct ideally, and if you're running her as a cryo DPS, you can run her with Chongyun and make all her attacks cryo. You can even do a freeze comp with Xingqiu as well, and that can be very strong. Alright, now we're going to do a DPS showcase. Keep in mind she is a burst support in this video. Once again, if you want to see a DPS video, let me know, I might make one. But she's going to be a burst support, but don't worry, she's going to be doing a ton of damage and it's going to be pretty impressive. Especially in the reverse melt comp, which I believe is great. And it's all 4 stars, so you can try it out. As usual, I'm going to be doing this a lot in Abyss 12, because it's like a neutral, hard piece of content. But also against bosses and in Abyss 11, which does give you a cryo buff, but it's also pretty cool to watch. So yeah. DPS showcase against a bunch of different stuff. And keep in mind, since she is a support, this is more of like a team comp showcase. I'm doing a few different comps, but all the characters in it are going to be doing tons of damage, especially Rosaria, but also like Xiangling, Kaeya. It's just going to be solid Rosaria comps that work well together. So keep that in mind, burst support showcase. With that being said, let's get right into it.
When you want to get off that darkest ground, the gravity pulls you straight down. From a bird's eye view, you should grow feathers and see this too. When you want to get off the darkest ground, the gravity pulls you straight down. When you want to get off the darkest ground, the gravity pulls you straight down. Clear sky. From a bird's eye view, you should grow feathers and see this too. 諦めて全力攻撃だ。話が通じないなら震えなさい。
So overall, I really like Rosaria. Some people say she's just a waifu Kaeya, and honestly, I think she's different enough, especially with her crit rate and with her C2 burst, for there to be different situations for both. But you can also run them together and effectively have like 2 Rosarias or 2 Kaeyas, and I really enjoy playing her. I like her design, and I think she's a pretty good support. As I said, not broken, but good, and so I think she's a well-balanced character, and I really like her. If there's anything I want to add, it's going to be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. Obviously, I appreciate subs and join the Discord if you want, all that stuff you already know. But with that being said, I hope this guide was helpful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.